Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and one of the most divisive and important and hot topics among peace workers these days is what is called no first use, or lately, sole purpose. That is the question of whether or not it's a good objective for peace workers to promote the idea of having nuclear armed countries pledge never to be first to launch a nuclear attack against any other country, but only to retain nuclear weapons as a retaliatory strike in case some other country attacks them. That's the policy of no first use, as I understand it. And it's a live topic now because President Biden, while he was running for office, declared that he favored the idea of having the United States declare that its policy would be one of no first use, or that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons would be for deterrence and retaliation in case of being struck by another country with nuclear weapons. So that was his position then. And there's a nuclear policy review going on in the Pentagon now. And the question is, will the US actually adopt that position? I'd like to have another conversation with Tariq Rauf, who is also, he's a Canadian. He's now living in Vienna and has worked in Stockholm for SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute for International Peace and Security, and at the International Agency for IAEA. I never can remember what it stands for exactly. Hi.
Hi. Nice to be with you again, Meta.
Yeah. And my assistant, Adam Wynn, is hanging around and may join us. All right, Tariq, did I give a proper, correct introductory passage about no first use, or I would certainly encourage you to correct any misinformation I passed on?
Well, I think you captured it well, Meta. So the proponents of no first use, as you mentioned, argue that countries that possess nuclear weapons, there are 9 of them now, should have a policy that none of them, as part of their military strategy and doctrine, base their nuclear forces on a first strike or using nuclear weapons first in any conflict whatsoever, and to only use nuclear weapons in retaliation when attacked with nuclear weapons. And this is where the second part comes in of sole purpose, that nuclear weapons be used only to deter and to respond to a nuclear attack. Some years ago, when in the United States, President Bush, the father, was the president, and also under President Clinton, the US created some ambiguity that the US could retaliate with nuclear weapons in response to threats or attacks from chemical weapons and biological weapons. Mm-hmm. Today, when President Biden is in office, there is a constituency that argues that the US should also threaten nuclear retaliation in case of a cyber attack that damages critical infrastructure like hospitals, like the electricity power grid, like oil refineries, and so on. So there is an ongoing live debate about the doctrine and the strategy for using nuclear weapons. The military, or most elements in the military in the US, not all, also make the argument they oppose no first use because from their point of view, it is important to keep the adversary in a state of uncertainty, that if the adversary does something that is perceived as a threat, they could be threatened and even preemptively attacked with nuclear weapons. So this is called damage limitation. Instead of waiting to be hit with a nuclear attack and then respond with whatever is left, one should take the offensive and attack preemptively. This school of thought also argues that US nuclear guarantees have kept many countries from developing their own nuclear weapons, and they point to countries like Japan and South Korea in the Far East, but they also point to many NATO countries such as Italy, Norway, Germany, and so on. And so the US argues that if they remove this uncertainty, these countries might feel threatened and they might also want to make nuclear weapons of their own. And therefore, the opponents in the military of no first use make the argument that against no first use, they make the argument that maintaining the possibility of a first strike is also a non-proliferation measure, as because of it, many countries that are allies have not developed their own weapons but rely on the US for their defense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me start by asking what's the difference between sole purpose and no first use. I've heard people say that they're the same, and I've heard other people say, no, there's some difference. Can you explain why this new terminology was adopted? And is it necessary to make some distinction that has escaped me?
Yes, so both of these concepts came up for discussion during the time of President Obama, especially after he made his speech in Prague in 2009, enunciating his vision for achieving a nuclear weapon-free world, but he also bounded it by saying it wouldn't happen during his lifetime. So no first use is a policy or a commitment not to use nuclear weapons first under any circumstances, and to use nuclear weapons only to retaliate against an attack against oneself or against one's allies. The sole purpose argument was developed a little bit later, after no first use was first discussed in the 1960s and 70s, saying that given the destructive nature of nuclear weapons, there needs to be proportionality. And in order to comply with international humanitarian law, to minimize casualties and damage, since nuclear weapons are weapons of mass destruction, by making them sole purpose means one would only use them to retaliate against a nuclear attack, but against a non-nuclear attack or a chemical weapons attack or a biological weapons attack, to retaliate using weapons other than nuclear weapons.
Okay. But now, as I understand it, the way Biden has framed it, it really is identical, right? That his intention with respect to sole purpose is pretty much to rule out any attack except retaliatory against nuclear weapons.
Yes, well, Biden made certain statements when he was a senator and when he was running for office. As far as I can remember, he hasn't repeated such statements after he became president. Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned in your introduction, like any new president, he has commissioned a nuclear posture review, which usually takes about a year to complete. Mm-hmm. But a lot of arms control supporters were quite exercised when earlier this month, an assistant secretary for defense who would oversee the nuclear posture review and was considered to be friendly to arms control was summarily dismissed from her office. And so people are concerned that by dismissing this assistant secretary who was deemed to be arms control friendly, it seems that the nuclear posture review would now be overseen by somebody who might be more of a skeptic on nuclear arms control, on no first use, and also perhaps on sole purpose.
Okay, well, I remember reading about that, but I think it wasn't that Biden sacked her as a woman, but yes. But that she was squeezed out by the people in the Pentagon, the hawks.
Yes, but at the end of the day, it's still his administration, and as they say, the buck stops on the president's table.
Okay.
We didn't hear any statements from the White House regretting the dismissal. or somehow criticizing the dismissal, or even asking for the person to be reinstated. So you're right. It was done from the Defense Department. So it was a Defense Department decision to relieve her. Nobody quite knows what the official or real reason is. I haven't seen any account published in the media citing that the Defense Department cited the following reasons for her dismissal. So that remains a bit of a mystery, and therefore people have concluded that given her background and given her tendency to prepare for defense through arms control also is a means of national defense. Arms control is not a concession to the enemy. Arms control is not a reward to the enemy. It's a way of reducing the threat to oneself.
Mm-hmm.
So arms control is an integral part of a country's defense policy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I think everybody takes it for granted that she was squeezed out for political reasons, or specifically because they didn't like her dovishness. So we will have to wait and see, I gather, but I'm not too optimistic. Okay, now you mentioned that the argument that the Hawks give is that if we didn't keep countries like, say, Japan under our nuclear umbrella, so to speak, which is a strange term, that they would want to build their own nuclear weapons. Well, I suppose it would vary from one country to another, but I talked to a guy named Gregory Kulaki, in Tokyo several months ago, who was at that time complaining that he was worried that the Japanese government was putting a lot of pressure on the US. He works for the Union of Concerned Scientists, I believe. And he said that the Japanese government was very worried that the US at that time might adopt this sole purpose policy, and they would not be happy about it. He didn't say that anybody there would be seriously considering creating a nuclear arsenal for Japan. And that idea didn't even come up. Tell me how realistic people are who make that argument that Japan, or tell me what other countries might be interested in really getting nuclear weapons if they were not part of the US extended deterrence policy.
Well, in the past, some nationalist, hardline Japanese politicians and even some retired officials periodically have hinted that Japan perhaps should develop nuclear weapons to defend itself against North Korea, defend itself against China, and also Russia. Remember that the Japanese and the Russians have this issue over the Northern Territories. These are these 4 islands that were captured by the Soviet Union during the Second World War.
Is that the Kuril Islands?
Yeah, they're also called the Kuril Islands, yes. They're also called Northern Territories, and there are many ancestral graves on those islands. And in any case, the Japanese claim that these are our islands. They were seized during the war, and now that the war has ended, they should be returned to Japan. And the Soviet position before Gorbachev, during Gorbachev's time, and now under President Putin's time, is that these islands belong to Russia and they will not be returned. So there is this sore point between Japan and Russia. Then also, the Japanese feel threatened with the Chinese military buildup. And then South Korea also expresses concerns about the North Korean military buildup. But both China and South Korea also complain and are worried about Japan getting nuclear weapons because they remember the times of Japanese colonization of these 2 countries and many atrocities that were committed there. So it's a very muddled picture in the Pacific area. But particularly after the precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan by President Biden, apparently without consulting the 50 other countries that were there. This apparently created some doubts in countries like Taiwan, China, and like South Korea and Japan, that we never know. Can we trust the Americans? Can we trust Biden? Is he really going to come to our defense if China becomes more assertive and aggressive? And therefore, maybe we should have the option of making nuclear weapons. So this argument that the U.S. extended deterrence and the U.S. Not adopting no first use and not adopting sole purpose contributes to non-proliferation and has prevented several countries from developing their own nuclear weapons is an assertion that is made by the military people. It is very difficult to prove it one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but what are some of the other countries that they claim? Well, actually, let's go back to a more basic question. What countries are covered by this extended deterrence doctrine? And is there such a thing as an official relationship, like not a treaty, but some deal, promise that has been made to certain countries that if they are attacked, the US will defend them with nuclear weapons or retaliate with nuclear weapons? And if so, what countries are covered by this thing? I'm not sure I never thought about it before, but what does extended deterrence look like on paper?
Well, extended deterrence, the way it is defined is that an attack on the allies of the US would be considered as an attack on the US itself. And therefore, the US would use whatever retaliatory measures that it felt appropriate, up to and including nuclear weapons. So now NATO nuclear doctrine says that NATO is a nuclear alliance, that NATO will maintain reliance on nuclear weapons as long as nuclear weapons exist, and that these weapons will be kept will be modernized and will be kept functional, and that they will have a mix of nuclear and conventional weapons. And Article 5 of the NPT says an attack on one is an attack on all.
Okay,
so,
now wait a minute. That means that automatically all countries that belong to NATO are covered by this promise. The US has promised this, whether or not they want it. And the reason I'm trying to unpack that is yesterday I had a conversation with Rebecca Johnson and Ward Wilson about whether or not it's possible to have for any nuclear or any country belonging to NATO to also sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And they believe that it's possible that these countries would simply opt out of this extended deterrence policy. They didn't use that word, but it would be that they claim not to want to have anything to do with the nuclear policy. But now, tell me, is it assumed by the US that they've made a commitment to all NATO countries, whether they say they want it or not?
Well, NATO recently reaffirmed its nuclear policy doctrine, which is what I just stated a minute or two ago, that NATO will remain a nuclear alliance as long as nuclear weapons exist. So this is sort of an oxymoron there, and that NATO will maintain nuclear weapons, will modernize them and update them. And that is why 5 countries host US nuclear weapons in Europe. That's Turkey, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, and Italy. So there are about roughly 200 non-strategic weapons based at these five bases in Europe. And this is to show to the Europeans the commitment that the US will, in fact, come to their defense using nuclear weapons, which is why these weapons are placed there. And so the countries which host nuclear weapons are part of the nuclear planning group, and Canada also used to be, and I think still is, a part of the nuclear planning group. So within NATO, there's a hierarchy. The countries that host US nuclear weapons are in the top tier, and then you have the rest of the countries that don't host nuclear weapons.
Mhm.
But in every NATO ministerial meeting and in the doctrine, they all agree that NATO is a nuclear alliance. So while many supporters of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and supporters of nuclear disarmament would like at least some of the NATO countries to peel away from this NATO doctrine, that hasn't happened yet. In fact, the opposite has happened. In October of 2016, the US sent a letter to all NATO countries to oppose the open-ended working group on multilateral negotiations on disarmament. And they also told them not to take part in the negotiations on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in 2017. And then last year, when the treaty was approaching entry into force, they also encouraged those countries that had already signed the TPNW to unsign it and leave the TPNW, let alone more countries to join it. So they are vehemently opposed to the TPNW.
Mhm.
And then
None of those countries complied with that demand, though. No, nobody has unsigned it, have they?
No, nobody unsigned it. It backfired.
Mm.
On the other hand, many countries that have signed have not ratified under pressure. So I think 86 or 90 countries have signed, but only 52 or 54 countries have ratified.
Mhm.
So countries that signed the treaty, I think, such as Switzerland and others, have not ratified it.
Mhm.
So this is their way of half in and half out.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has become one lightning rod between the NATO countries and the countries in nuclear alliances and the TPNW supporters. And this will be a big issue at the NPT review conference in January if it takes place at that time.
Mhm. Okay, will it get clarified there, or will there just be a big storm over the
There'll be a
issue?
big storm because the supporters of the TPNW are not going to change their position, and the opponents are also not going to change their position.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the opponents have more powerful countries in there. So smaller countries like Austria, where I am, which has been a champion of the humanitarian initiative, of the impact of nuclear weapons, and also a champion of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, comes under heavy pressure from France and also the UK before Brexit. And as a small country, it's very difficult for them to juggle their policy to defend the TPNW up to a point, but not to go overboard in defending it, that they get a backlash from their NATO EU members in the European Union. So this divide at the moment, nobody sees any prospects for it healing. And very likely the nuclear posture review under Biden will reassert the necessity for nuclear weapons, will reaffirm that the US needs to build new land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Mm.
They need to build new submarines and new submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And they also need to build new long-range bombers. So they want to recapitalize what they refer to as the nuclear weapons enterprise. So if that happens, we will have functional nuclear weapons until at least the end of the century.
Mhm. Yeah, okay. Now, so it's ambiguous, I gather, whether or not all members of NATO are equally really covered by the extended deterrence policy. According to the US, they are, and maybe according to some of them, they aren't, or they don't want to be. Is that fair to say?
Well, if there are some who don't want to be, haven't said so in public as far as I can see.
Okay.
So there are, I think, elements within political parties that would like to leave NATO or would like to dissociate themselves from the nuclear part of the alliance. And people thought that perhaps Belgium might be one of such countries, but that hasn't happened.
Mm-hmm.
So the view is that we need one country to defect and then others would follow suit. So maybe that happens.
Yeah. Okay, now then let's go back outside of NATO. If the US says that that it will defend its allies or retaliate on behalf of its allies with nuclear weapons. That includes countries that are not part of NATO. And we mentioned Japan. What other countries are considered allies in this sense, a part of the extended deterrence? And is there a formal agreement to that effect, or is it just a generalized expression of goodwill toward certain countries?
Well, the U.S.-Japan Defense Treaty, the U.S.-South Korea Defense Treaty are explicitly called for U.S. to use nuclear weapons if it so decides against a threat. Also, the Australia-New Zealand U.S. alliance, ANZUS, also included a nuclear component until New Zealand stepped out of that. So they remain a party to ANZUS, but they say we don't want to have anything to do with U.S. nuclear policy.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the NATO countries, it's South Korea, it's Japan, it's Australia, and it's also Taiwan, China, which are all covered under these mutual defense agreements with the U.S.
Okay, Taiwan, China is the interesting question, because things are getting really ugly there between mainland China and Taiwan, and really it looks like there could really be a war. What kind of commitments are there, or is there really a commitment? You haven't really said that Taiwan is part of the deal.
Well, there were times when Taiwan was discovered to be working on developing a nuclear weapon program twice, and the U.S. put pressure on them to shut it down. And as part of the deal, they said, you don't need to make nuclear weapons. We will protect you with our nuclear weapons should you face a grave threat.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And they believe them, or do they want it? I mean, does Taiwan want such a commitment?
Yes, Taiwan definitely wants such a commitment because they say they want to remain independent, that they do not accept that they would be unified with China. So,
okay, well, wanting to be independent doesn't necessarily translate into wanting nuclear weapons as a source of protection. I mean, there's a logical connection, but I would think you and I could make an argument that it would not be a good thing to be under a nuclear umbrella. You would not be safer because of it. At least I would make that argument.
Yes, so that's the argument now that we have this new alliance called AUKUS, Australia, United Kingdom, United States, under which the U.S. will supply 8 to 10 nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. China has already come out and said that if you get these nuclear-powered submarines, you will be on our nuclear target list, which is not the case now. And then when it comes to Taiwan, China
has, excuse me, but China had always said that they had a no first use policy. So then wouldn't that be contradicting their own no first use policy to say they would put Australia on their list of potential targets for only
well, those are two separate things.
Pardon?
Yeah, but they're two separate things. You can be on a list of targets. That doesn't automatically mean that they would be attacked with nuclear weapons. It's just a way of threatening to influence behavior. Also, in the U.S. military now, they say we have doubts that they say that in our view, China no longer has a no first use policy. That's the view of many in the U.S. military.
What do you think?
They say given the Chinese buildup of land-based and sea-based nuclear weapons, and given the Chinese policy as enunciated, they feel that China is no longer abiding by its no first use, and that should there be a war with the U.S., China wouldn't use nuclear weapons basically to destroy or attack the United States aircraft carrier fleet. because China would be vulnerable to bombers or aircraft taking off from the carrier fleet and also cruise missiles. And so some of the Chinese missiles and nuclear weapons are supposedly designed to sink US nuclear carrier battle groups in the Pacific. And that is why in the US military, they say we no longer believe that China is practicing a policy of no first use.
Well, they've also been discovered recently to be building silos, hundreds of silos for ICBMs. I wonder if that is consistent with the notion that they're not into first use.
Well, there have been these satellite images produced by two think tanks which show these silos, about 300 of them, and the argument given by these think tanks is that these silos will be connected underground by tunnels, and so that the Chinese missiles would play a sort of game of musical chairs, so the US would never know which silo has a missile and which silo is empty, and therefore it would need to use many nuclear weapons to try and destroy as many silos as possible to eliminate the risk of any surviving missiles. But, you know, the satellite imagery is still questionable.
Oh.
So, you know, some of them say, well, these silos have been dug in the first half of this year. So we are only shown photos of these silos, so to speak. But we are not shown photos. I mean, what happens to all the earth or dirt that comes out of when you dig a hole? You know, earth comes out of it. You have to put it somewhere. And so there should have been drilling equipment. There should have been trucks to haul it away. And so how come we can get pictures of the silos, but we can't get pictures of the construction of the silos? So there are some people who feel that, you know, there are also very large wind farms in that area, in the Tumen area. And there's one of the world's largest wind farms there. And that these could be foundations for new windmills, but they're called aerogenerators. Mm. So again, there's a controversy here, although more and more people are speculating in the media that these are indeed silos. But then we say, okay, well, if they're silos, why don't you show us imagery from earlier in the year when they were being constructed? Mm-hmm. You know, what happened to all the earth that comes out of a, you know, whatever 30, 40 meter silo, which is about 10, 15 meters in diameter, you're looking at many cubic meters of earth that has to be put somewhere. And a satellite image using thermal imagery can see the earth which is on the surface and then the earth that has come out of the hole. They will have a different image. So how come we never see any of those?
Okay, because well, I apologize. I did not ask the right question. I did an interview with Matt Korda, who was the guy who found these things.
Yeah, he found one set of them.
Yeah, right. But I didn't think to ask him what happened to all the dirt. But it's a good
so you ask him that, you know, both of these, the Federation of American Scientists and I think Monterey Institute, they both say that these silos were constructed this year. So, and meaning between beginning of the year till about June or July when these pictures came out. So in the first 6 or 7 months. And the pictures are from commercial satellite imagery companies that are constantly taking pictures every day. And FAS and others will just go buy the pictures from them. And they say, give us the pictures from 12th of October, for example, over Toronto or whatever. So why don't they buy some earlier pictures so they can justify their claim that they are indeed silos? And also, you know, if these silos are meant for mobile missiles, where you have missiles mounted on trucks that play a game of hide and seek, put the silo in this hole and then, you know, take it out and put it in that silo, I mean the missile, there should be some tracks on the desert floor, etc., etc. So there are many missing pictures. So I'm not saying these are not necessarily silos, but those who want to make the claim need to give us more supporting information.
Okay, fair enough. Adam had his hand up. Adam, you have something you want to say?
Well, yes, you were mentioning the prospect of nuclear weapons within the Taiwan context, and I'm just wondering historically, do we know if the United Kingdom ever stored nuclear weapons in the Hong Kong territory prior to 1997? And if so, how did that interact with the Chinese nuclear weapon program? Is there a precedent for nuclear weapons in those island territories off the south coast of China?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I can't answer it because I haven't seen anything written up about it. I think it would be quite unlikely that the UK would put nuclear weapons in Hong Kong where they would be so vulnerable to seizure by China. But, China could come and occupy Hong Kong before the British could defend it without using nuclear weapons. So I think that's a good research question that people can look into, but I personally would doubt it.
Hey, how about, would they be able to detect it? Suppose the British had wanted to bring some in, but didn't want the Chinese to know. Is there any way of detecting the presence of nuclear weapons by picking up stray rays that are being emitted from the fissile materials? Or is it something that you could hide?
Well, the UK might have brought in a ship or a submarine into Hong Kong port that might have nuclear weapons. That might be quite possible. But to put them on land, I think is very unlikely because one needs supporting facilities. One cannot just put them anywhere. You need security, you need guards, and you need special care for these weapons. In 1987, the Soviet Union and the United States did an exercise, or maybe a little bit later, in the Black Sea, where some missiles on a Soviet missile destroyer, and they flew a helicopter with a sensing device hanging from it, and it flew around the ship to see if they could pick up any traces of certain types of radiation, and they did. But you have to be very close to it, within 4 or 5 meters. So one wouldn't be able to pick it up at a kilometer distance or hundreds of meters distance.
Yes, I think that's a story that Frank Van Hippel told me about being, these guys were waving at them, the helicopter or whatever, not realizing that they were actually able to detect their nuclear weapons.
Yeah, so this was part of a deliberate experiment when the relations were good under Perestroika and Glasnost of Gorbachev. They also did the monitoring experiments at each other's nuclear test sites. And so the Russians went to Nevada, Americans went to Semipalatinsk to do measurements of tests. But those were those days in the mid-1980s, and we are now a far distance from that time.
Okay, you before we started this online chat, you were saying something about your concern about the purchase of nuclear powered submarines by Australia and this new deal between Australia, UK, and the US. And that would you explain your reasoning of why do you think that is a threat toward the potential movement in the direction of nuclear arms by, I presume you mean by Australia?
Well, yes. When we read the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it says a country like Australia or Canada, a non-nuclear weapon state, has to put all of its peaceful nuclear activities under IAEA verification or safeguards. So that leaves open the possibility of certain non-peaceful military activities that are not a nuclear weapon. So these could be naval nuclear propulsion or space nuclear propulsion, using a nuclear reactor to provide the power for a submarine or a ship or an aircraft carrier, or to have a nuclear battery that powers a satellite. And you might recall that in the 70s, a Cosmos satellite crashed over the Northwest Territories in Canada, spreading a lot of radioactive material, which took several years to scoop up and millions of dollars in costs. So the concern here is that under the verification agreement, there is a loophole or a gray area where a non-nuclear weapon country like Australia or Canada or Germany can exempt from verification or safeguard the nuclear material in a nuclear reactor powering a submarine or a ship on the grounds that this is classified military information. So a nuclear submarine of the US uses weapon-grade highly enriched uranium between 93 to 97% enrichment. This is what is called direct use material for a nuclear weapon. And each submarine would have about 500 kilograms or so in the core. And one can make a nuclear weapon with 25 kilograms or even less, or 15 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. So the concern is that this nuclear material, even though it is in a submarine reactor, will be outside of international or IAEA verification. IAEA would not be informed about the total quantity of such material. They would not be informed about the enrichment level of such material. So there is a possibility of diversion from submarine use to military use. And if Australia gets this, then Brazil would also want it. They've been working on a naval nuclear reactor for many years. If Australia gets it, there will be pressure for Japan to get these submarines as well. So would South Korea want them, so would Taiwan, China, and others. And even Canada, now that its 4 submarines are becoming old, the debate in Canada for having nuclear submarines, especially to protect the Arctic, which is now melting, and the Northwest Passage, that debate would also be stirred up. So the fact that this material is outside of any international verification is the main concern. Secondly, these submarines will be armed with the Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles. Although these cruise missiles are said not to be armed with nuclear weapons, but only with conventional weapons. But how would China and Russia know that these missiles only have conventional weapons and not nuclear weapons? You know, the Australians and the US and the British would not believe if the Russians or the Chinese said, well, this submarine has cruise missiles, but believe us, it only has conventional armed warheads on them and not nuclear. On this side, they would have to assume that these missiles have a nuclear warhead unless they're open for verification, which is not going to happen. So there are several layers of concern here about the spread of nuclear submarines to non-nuclear weapon states. At the moment, there is no non-nuclear weapon state that is operating a nuclear-powered nuclear submarine or ship. India is the only country outside the 5 nuclear weapon states. It leased a nuclear submarine from the Soviet Union, and then the Russians gave them another nuclear submarine. And then they have copied it to make one of their own, which in its first voyage had some sort of incident. Other than that, no other country besides the 5 nuclear weapon states have nuclear submarines. So again, this is creating increased nuclear risks. And, you know, in some of our discussions and some of your sessions before, a number of people in the peace movement have talked about reducing nuclear risks. But here we would be increasing nuclear risks because the Chinese and the Russians will want to respond. And instead of reducing risks of a nuclear conflict in the Pacific, likely we may end up increasing it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, it sounds as if I'm jumping to the conclusion that if you had your druthers, your way of solving both of these objections would be to put them under IAEA control or subject them to inspection. Is there any precedent for any nuclear weapon being subject to monitoring by IAEA?
No, under the IAEA statute, it was deliberately not given a role in verification of nuclear disarmament. It only has a role in the verification of nuclear non-proliferation. But in the IAEA statute, it also says that the IAEA can support United Nations mandated nuclear disarmament efforts. Therefore, the IAEA could contribute to the verification of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons because it was adopted under United Nations auspices. But the nuclear weapon states have consistently objected to the IAEA having any role in verifying nuclear disarmament by the nuclear weapon states. So the IAEA's contribution is to prevent nuclear material from going from peaceful use to weapons use in non-nuclear weapon countries.
Okay.
So that's one part of its mandate. The second part of its mandate is to promote the use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. And many in the peace movement think that these two objectives are contradictory. The IAEA cannot promote the use of civil nuclear energy and at the same time try to verify it. This is another controversial issue.
It's controversial to the extent that I'm going to say that I'm on that side, and I do so realizing that probably it will not sit well with you because you're bound to disagree with me, right?
Yeah, I believe that, we still need nuclear energy for the next 30, 40 years in order to make the transition to a completely renewable energy source. There's no incident of a country using civil nuclear power to make a weapon. Those that have nuclear weapons had a dedicated program. But
well, wasn't that true for India, though, that they took Canadian CANDU reactors and used them to get the material for their weapons?
This is correct. So they used a Canadian research reactor, not a CANDU reactor, but a research reactor. And they violated the commitments to Canada and the US. And that is why they called their weapon a peaceful nuclear explosion.
Yeah.
But they had a dedicated nuclear weapon program. And so they didn't use the CANDU reactor, they used the research reactor. So research reactors are also plutonium production reactors. And that is why they use the plutonium from the fuel from the CIRUS reactor. So yes, you have a point there. So this is not a really hard and fast distinction to be made here on this particular matter of the connection between nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. Opponents would also say that the scientists can gain expertise in handling nuclear material on the civil side and then use that expertise in handling nuclear material on the military side to make nuclear weapons, and therefore there is the connection. One can find very good arguments on both sides to justify the case, depending where one sits.
Okay. So now we never did give you a chance to take your own position on the whole no first use question. You described what other people think, but I believe in the conversation we had with Gary Seymour that you agreed with him that, tell me what your position is about no first use or sole purpose.
So I'm not opposed to no first use per se, but my position is that no matter how useful no first use is, we cannot verify it. It's only a declaratory position. And secondly, no first use does not lead to a single nuclear warhead or a single nuclear weapon being removed and dismantled. And since we only have limited amounts of energy and money on the peace movement and the disarmament side, I would rather use our scarce resources, time, and efforts to promote treaties and agreements that actually reduce nuclear weapons, like the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And so we're not saying that one should not promote no first use, but no first use in and of itself is not sufficient. And from my point of view, diverting energy from the bigger or the higher goal of getting rid of nuclear weapons and getting to a world free of nuclear weapons. It's like gun control. You can have the gun, but I promise not to shoot somebody. But the gun is still there. It's still in my house. It's still in my holster. Tomorrow I could lose my mind and, go out and shoot somebody. So there's no lock on the gun. There's no seal on the gun that, I have to break or something. It's not locked away where you keep the key, but the gun is in my house. So this is the issue with no first use. So it's not that it's a bad thing or that we should not agitate for it. But for me, no first use has become a substitute for many peace groups in lieu of really working towards nuclear disarmament. And
a lot of people would certainly say that the top priority should be working toward getting the TPNW accepted as widely as possible, and of course, ultimately by the nuclear powers. Other people would say, well, that's a pipe dream. That's not going to happen. And so what can we do that's a halfway measure, a step in the right direction, while we also hope that in the long run, yes, even the US will join the TPNW. So what alternative steps in the right direction would you consider really worth putting some energy into?
Yeah, so I mean, you make a good argument about no first use. I'm not saying that argument is not credible or there is not strength behind it or there is not logic. It is logical and it's a perfectly legitimate thing to work for and to aim for. I would also put efforts to try and reduce these risks by pushing for more treaties so we don't build nuclear weapons and perpetuate the nuclear deterrence model of the previous 75 years or so, which is what we seem to be doing now. And also, there are many treaties from the past which people have forgotten. There is a treaty between the Russians, Soviets, and the Americans on prevention of accidental nuclear war. There are nuclear risk reduction agreements of not having that many weapons on ready-to-launch status, or to reduce the number of weapons that are on ready-to-launch status, deactivate the land-based ballistic missiles. So it would take a couple of days to put them back into option, to have operational status. Bombers no longer carry nuclear weapons routinely. You would have to arm them, so there already is a fire break. And as one saw, last year, after the US election, many people were concerned about Donald Trump's mental stability. And there are reports coming out that the chief of the US military phoned up his Chinese counterpart to reassure them, don't worry, we are not going to nuke you. And for people like former US Defense Secretary Bill Perry and others are saying, we need to change the system in the US where one man or one person, the president, has the sole authority to give the launch order. So I think that is also something useful because that is preventing something from happening, and it's something that is visible. If it's a 2-person decision or a 3-person decision. So I'm not saying no first use is we shouldn't do it, but my view is that no first use in and of itself is not sufficient.
Okay, I hear you. That's interesting, and obviously, I would certainly be in favor of any of these alternative things that I have forgotten too. You say we haven't paid attention to these alternative old treaties that had existed, or have they expired, or what's the story?
No, they haven't expired. And, in the past, we've also had a UN conference on prevention of accidental war. So it's time, maybe we could have another, so we could bring all these issues to the table, point out the dangers. This is what the Humanitarian Initiative tried to do, to point out the dangers of nuclear weapons and the impact of explosion on the environment and human beings.
Yes, thank you. You mentioned the United States context of how one man, the president, and my apologies if you hear noise in the background of this construction, but you mentioned the United States context where one man, the president, can order a nuclear strike. How does that compare to the other countries' systems for implementing a nuclear strike? How would it compare to, say, Russia or China, India, or any other number of the nuclear states? Are they all in a similar situation where one person at the top of the pyramid can determine where and when a strike occurs? And also, you mentioned accidental nuclear war, and I just want to flag this wonderful publication that Pugwash put out that I picked up at John Poliani's talk here in Toronto about accidental nuclear war. It's a really, really detailed and really great publication.
When was it published?
1990, so it's a bit old now, but it
is
does
it available on the web?
I'm not sure if it's available online. They were giving out physical copies when John Poliani gave a talk a year or two ago about what can Canada do to prevent nuclear war.
Yeah. So maybe it can be scanned and put on the website of somebody.
Mhm. That's good. Yeah, good.
Yeah, I mean, my paper also on nuclear submarines from 1988 is before the days of the web, so to speak. So I scanned it and put it on the web.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we really don't know. The U.S. gets most of the criticism because it's the most transparent of the nuclear weapon states. And, just a few days ago, they put out a complete inventory of how many nuclear weapons they have and how many nuclear weapons they have dismantled and destroyed. This was data that used to be given out, but then Trump put it under a cloak of secrecy. And now the U.S. has put it out. So you can see how many weapons they have dismantled, how many they've dismantled in the last year. So this is a good model for others to follow. But we presume that it's pretty much the same in the other countries with nuclear weapons, with President Putin, with President Xi Jinping, President Macron, also the British Prime Minister. And one apocryphal story is that one of the first tasks of a new British Prime Minister is to write by hand 4 identical letters to the commanders of the 4 British nuclear submarines with nuclear weapons, telling them under what conditions to launch nuclear weapons and what to do if the United Kingdom is obliterated as a result of a nuclear attack. And the prime ministers have said this has been their most sobering moment when they had to sit down and write such a letter by hand to sort of somehow come to terms with this responsibility that they have, whereas on the outside it looked all glamorous being a prime minister, but now you have to do this. And there's also an exchange between 2 United Kingdom nuclear submarine commanders, where one submarine commander said that, this is both of them retired, that he thought that it would be illegal for a UK submarine commander to launch nuclear weapons given the destruction that would be caused at the other end. And the other British submariner said, no, this would be insubordination, and the first commander should really follow the orders that were given to him. And it was not up to him to question the quote unquote, the legality of the order. So these are sort of interesting questions about under what conditions to authorize use of nuclear weapons, who authorizes them. Now, we have to, in this discussion, it's a little bit simplified. Trump doesn't really have a finger on the button, so to speak. He has to initiate a procedure that then goes down the chain of command, authenticating orders, launch orders, and so on. So there are a number of fire breaks. But legally speaking, if the president gives the order, it has to be implemented. But in practice, it's the military that will give the final order to somebody to press the button. And so those who claim that, this presidential authority exists on paper, but in practice, the military would question whether the order was legal, whether in their view the president still had his or her marbles and hadn't gone nutty or wasn't drunk or gone crazy, and that it's not so dangerous. Other people say, well, if you follow the rules, once the president says go, you have to go. So this again is an interesting debate that is going on at the moment.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Meta.
Been fun. Take care.
Thanks.
Be
Bye.
well. Bye.